Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about real GDP and price levels in the long run. First we want to talk about what aggregate supply is. It's the total of all planned production for the economy and can be represented by an aggregate supply curve. In the long run we have long run aggregate supply, which is a vertical line representing the real output of goods and services after full adjustment has occurred. It represents the real GDP of the economy under conditions of full employment, and the economy is on its production possibilities curve. On the left, we have a production possibilities curve, so just imagine that we're on some point on that. And on the right, we have a long-run aggregate supply curve, which of course is vertical. This is because input prices fully adjust to changes in output prices. Suppliers at this point have no incentive to increase output, and unemployment is at its natural rate. The long-run aggregate supply curve is determined by endowments and technology or existing resources. We also want to remember what base year dollars are. It's the value of current sum expressed in the terms of prices in a base year. So you just pick a year and say that is your base. What is an endowment? An endowment is the various resources in an economy, including both physical resources and things of like ingenuity and management skills. Growth is shown by outward shifts of either the production possibilities curves or the long-run aggregate supply curve caused by things like growth in population and labor force, if you remember from the previous chapter. Capital accumulation, or the growth of capital from the previous chapter, you can kind of think of, and improvements in technology as well. On the left we have the production possibilities curve shifting out, and on the right we have the long run aggregate supply curve shifting out. Here's an example of long run real GDP growth on some growth path. We also want to think about the other side of aggregate demand. It's the total of all planned expenditures in the entire economy. So what determines the total amount that individuals, governments, and firms and foreigners want to spend? What determines the equilibrium price level? Well, we have the aggregate demand curve, which is a curve showing planned purchase rates for all final goods and services in the economy at various price levels, all other things held constant. Here is a graph of an aggregate demand curve, and we can kind of see different points and quantity and price level combinations. So what happens when price level rises? The real balance effect could happen, and we'll talk about all of these, of course, in a couple of slides. There's an interest rate effect or the open economy effect. What happens when the price level falls? Well, total planned spending should increase. So what is the real balance effect? It's the change in expenditures resulting from a change in the real value of money balances when the price changes, all other things held constant. You may also think of it like a wealth effect, which you may have heard of. What about the interest rate effect? Higher price levels indirectly increase the interest rate, which in turn causes a reduction in borrowing and spending. It's one of the reasons that the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. There's also the open economy effect, which is the higher price levels result in foreigners desiring to buy fewer American-made products, while Americans desire to buy more foreign-made products, that is, net exports fall. It's equivalent to a reduction in the amount of real goods and services purchased in the United States. So we also want to think about aggregate demand versus demand for a single good or services. When the aggregate demand curve is derived, we're looking at total planned expenditures on all goods and services, right? We're looking like at the entire economic system. When a demand curve is derived, we're only looking at a single good or service in one market. Any non-price level change that increases aggregate spending on domestic goods shifts aggregate demand to the right. Any non-price level change that decreases aggregate spending on domestic goods shifts the aggregate demand to the left. Here's kind of a nice table talking about different determinants of aggregate demand that may be helpful to pause and look over. So long-run equilibrium and price level. For the economy as a whole, long-run equilibrium occurs at the price level where the aggregate demand curve crosses or equals the long-run aggregate supply curve. So remember, we have our long-run aggregate supply, which is a vertical line, and then aggregate demand. And so we have this equilibrium point at price level of 120. The effects of economic growth on price level, and we're going to, of course, talk about economic growth and secular deflation in a bit. So secular deflation is a persistent decline in prices resulting from economic growth in the presence of stable aggregate demand. An increase in long-run aggregate supply will, all else equal, result in a decrease in the price level. So how do we avoid secular deflation? If aggregate demand shifts outward by the same amount as the long-run average supply curve, the price level remains constant. The aggregate demand curve can be shifted outward by increasing the money supply. Right? And here's kind of an example. And you can imagine if it was shifted in such a way where, well, look at that, where now you're at AD2, where now price levels remain the same. So we want to talk about inflation also. So figure 10.8, which is, I guess, the next slide, is going to talk about different causes of supply-side inflation. And now we have another graph of inflation rates in the United States over time. So to explain persistent inflation, we can kind of go back to thinking about supply and demand. Suppose demand stays the same, but aggregate supply maybe, or long-run aggregate supply maybe decreases, and then prices would increase, right? So now on the next slide, we're going to look at demand-side inflation, which is just going to be a shift in demand. See, as demand shifts outward, prices go up. This is inflation. Finally, just looking at 2000, I believe, 9 as our base year. Yep. We're looking at real GDP and the price level in the United States over time. And it's pretty consistent in how it sort of increases. There's a little bit of a kind of quagmire of the effect right here from the crisis in 2008, but overall increasing.